Hello, my name is Nigel Hicks. I'm a professional photographer and writer based in Devon in southwest England. What I want to talk to you today about is a project I completed recently in the Philippines, focusing in on the wildlife, the wild habitats and the protected areas of that beautiful country. Now, that project as a whole covered a whole range of habitats from submarine coral reefs through various rainforests to the mountain summits, and wildlife from tiny fish through various plants to the mighty Philippine eagle. All that material has recently been published in a book, and that book is this one, Wild Philippines, put out by John Beaufoy Publishing. But today what we're going to talk about is just some of the representative bird species of the country, most especially the endemic species, or those that are unique to the Philippines. Before we come to that photography, I'm going to show you a few short video clips showing me going around the Philippines doing this work, which I hope you will find entertaining. 5:30 in the morning, and we're just paddling out across, I can't remember the name of the lake now, never mind, we're paddling out across one of the lakes in a Goosen Marsh. Got my man behind me, and just looking across at somebody else paddling a canoe just alongside us. We're in a tiny little canoe, whoops, we're on a lake, it's very shallow, we're just running around, so it's the dry season, even though it doesn't actually stop raining here. As you can see, there's how much the sweat is pouring off me. If I home in on myself, I'm absolutely dripping wet. Trying to take some photographs of this forest. You can see my camera's right here, and right now this is on the back of this truck heading up into the northern Sierra Madre Mountains. It's getting the road's getting kind of a little bit rough. We're having trouble spotting too many birds. We've got a few herons of different sorts, purple heron and a bittern, a couple of bitterns actually. And yeah, well, it's nice being out here anyway. So at about 2,450 metres now according to the GPS, and this is what we're looking at. A real big gash in the mountain where you've got a whole series of solfataras lining the mountain. A lot of the rocks quite yellow, and so here we are. It's great to have the hike finished. I feel almost human now. I've got my coffee in my hand and feeling much better, very much. So we are going to have some lunch, and then we're going to push off back down the mountain through the forest to Tunfis. We'll talk again later. Well, I hope you enjoyed those video clips. Now the photography. This landscape image sets the scene, showing the Philippines to be a mountainous country, which large parts of it certainly are. It's an archipelago consisting of over 7,000 islands lying off the eastern side of Southeast Asia. There are no land borders, and in fact very little of the country has ever had any direct land link with mainland Southeast Asia. The great majority of it has risen straight up from the seabed, either as tectonically uplifted mountains, volcanoes, or coral reef construction. This, of course, has had a major impact on the wildlife, which has gone down its own evolutionary path, quite distinct from that of Southeast Asia, resulting in vast numbers of plants and animals completely unique to the country. This is true for the birds as it is for any other species in the country, and we'll come on and talk about that a little more in a few minutes. Quite apart from the mountainous landscape shown in this image, another thing this picture shows, of course, is deforestation and the continual spread of farmland into the forest, eating away at the edges of the forest all the time. This picture actually is taken inside Mount Apo Natural Park. Mount Apo being the country's highest mountain, surrounded by one of the country's most important protected areas, and yet here we see farmland creeping ever further inside the protected area. It's a constant ongoing problem, with such deforestation having a major impact on the endemic wildlife of the country, causing much of it to be seriously endangered. Not surprisingly, much of the accessible lowlands was deforested some time ago, and as you can see in this picture, the farmland is now creeping ever further up into the mountain forests. Despite deforestation, there are still some areas of extensive rainforest, even at sea level, starting with the coastline and these coastal mangroves. This image here shows a particularly fine example of a coastal mangrove on the island of Palawan in the far west of the country. It's a really primeval kind of habitat and landscape, very difficult to get around in due to the great tangle of roots and branches and so on that you see. But if you have a boat at high tide, it's really good places to explore, where you can find quite a variety of birds, most especially types of egrets, herons and kingfishers, of course. It's a lot of migratory and non-endemic species, though there are also a number of endemic species that you'll find in these mangroves. And as we move inland from the coast, we will find that large areas of the lowland countryside has been converted to agriculture, but there are still a few areas of lowland rainforest surviving. And in this image, you see a particularly fine example of that on the lower slopes of Mount Bulusan, which is one of the country's most active volcanoes. This lowland rainforest is typified by a lot of tall, straight trees with an understory that is rich in palms, as you can see in this picture. Although it is very hot and humid in these places, they are also extremely beautiful and a huge diversity of wildlife here, both plant and animal, including quite a range of endemic bird species. And as we head higher into the mountains, past an altitude of about 1,000 meters or 3,300 feet, so the lowland rainforest gives way to what is called montane rainforest. The trees become smaller, denser, more tangled. Palms are replaced by tree ferns, which become very common here, and it's altogether a very different kind of landscape and habitat, a much more primeval place. It's well illustrated by this picture, which shows montane rainforest on the slopes of Mount Canlaon, which is one of the Philippines' most active volcanoes again. This one's situated on the island of Negros in the central south of the country. That was a brief introduction to the main types of forests you'll find in the Philippines, home to the overwhelming majority of Philippine birds, most especially the endemic species. Now, there are known to be just over 600 species of bird in the Philippines, with just under a third of those endemics. They range in size from the tiny flower peckers, of which there are several species, right up to this giant, which is the Philippine eagle, one of the world's largest raptors. It is also one of the Philippines' most endangered birds, with just a few hundred birds left in the wild. Being a top predator and very much a forest bird, it requires large areas of healthy rainforest in which to hunt, something that in the Philippines is increasingly in short supply. Hence, these days it is very thinly spread, with most birds known to be in forests on Mindanao in the far south of the country, a few in the forests on Samar, which is an island in the central south, and then again in the remote mountains in the Sierra Madre in the far north of the country. Over the last 20 or more years, the Philippine Eagle Foundation has been leading the charge to save this bird from extinction. And in recent years, it's actually been quite successful with a captive breeding program based at its headquarters just outside the city of Davao in the far south of the country. And that's where this particular picture was taken. Their success has reached a point now where a while ago they did start experimenting with the release of captively bred birds into the wild. So there is some cause for hope for the future with this bird. If the Philippine eagle is the largest and one of the most endangered of the country's endemic birds, then this bird here is one of the commonest and smallest of the endemics. It is the Philippine bulbul. It's found across most of the country. It is a woodland bird, but it's happy with not just good quality primary rainforest, but also secondary forests and farmland too. So it is very commonly seen. Although there is just a single species across the country, there are several varieties, each variety restricted to a particular region and island grouping. This bird you see here is the Mindoro Philippine bulbul, photographed, not surprisingly, on the island of Mindoro. There are numerous species of kingfisher spread right across the Philippines, some of them endemic to the country, others more widely spread around South and Southeast Asia. What you see here is the Philippine white-throated kingfisher, which is a very interesting bird because until a few years ago it was classed as the same species as that found in mainland Southeast Asia. But more recently it's been given its own individual species status, so it is now a Philippine endemic. It is quite easily distinguished, in fact, from its Southeast Asian cousin, because in the latter species, that white patch you see spreads down across quite a large part of the breast, whereas in the Philippine species, as you can see in this individual, it's really quite small, restricted to just a small area below the bill. The Philippine white-throated kingfisher is quite a large bird, and it is also quite commonly seen as well around all sorts of forests, sometimes near water, but not necessarily so. And so it's often thought of as being a forest bird rather than a waterside bird. Now we move on to something quite different. This is the Palawan peacock pheasant, the Philippines' only pheasant species. And that, of course, immediately makes the Philippines quite different from mainland Southeast Asia with its numerous pheasant species. Now, the Palawan peacock pheasant is endemic just to the island of Palawan in the far west of the country. And since Palawan is the only part of the Philippines ever to have had a land link with mainland Southeast Asia, this bird is in some ways rather emblematic of that long lost land link period. Clearly, at some point during that land link, a pheasant has moved across from perhaps Malaysia into Palawan and then subsequently evolved into this distinct peacock pheasant species. And so we come to hornbills. Philippine hornbills are really fascinating for all kinds of reasons. Until a few years ago, there were just 5 species in the Philippines, but they have recently grown to 11. That's because of the splitting of several subspecies into their own individual species status. Now, all 11 species are endemic to the Philippines, and each one is restricted to a particular region of the country. Not one of them lives across the whole country. All of them are seriously endangered and so are therefore, in theory at least, protected. The one hornbill that has undergone the most splitting from subspecies into individual species is the Tyrichtic hornbills, and this is one of these. This is the Samar hornbill, which is restricted primarily to the island of Samar in central south, but also to a few neighbouring islands, including Bohol, Leyte, and Dinagat. This particular individual you see here, I was really lucky to find in a small group of Samar hornbills in trees over a river that I was just motoring along in a small boat in the heart of the forest on Samar. So I was able to get some nice shots. They weren't particularly shy, so it was a really great opportunity to get close to these birds and get some nice photographs. This is a cousin of the Samar hornbill. This is the Visayan Tyrichtic hornbill. It's restricted to forests on the islands of Negros and Panay in the heart of the Visayan Islands in the central south part of the country. You can see it looks quite similar to the Samar hornbill, but there are some differences in the markings on the casque, a little bit around the face, and I think the tails are actually rather different as well. And so we come to a hornbill that is clearly quite different from the previous two. This is the Palawan hornbill, which is restricted to the islands of Palawan in the far west of the country. Like all Philippine hornbills, it is endangered, but it's probably one of the least endangered of the hornbills in this country. You can still see it in some parts of Palawan quite easily, most especially in the forests on the islands in Bakwit Bay near El Nido, which is in the far north of Palawan. And then we come to the pigeons. There are rather more than 30 species of pigeon in the Philippines, the majority of which are endemic to the country, though others are spread around South and Southeast Asia. Like the hornbills, they are very important to forest ecology. Their seed spreading activity is crucial to the maintenance and restoration of the forest environment. I'm only going to show you the one species today, and that's this one, which you'll be not surprised to hear is called a bleeding heart pigeon. There are 5 species of bleeding heart pigeons in the Philippines, all of them endemic to the country. In fact, not only are they endemic to the Philippines, but each one is endemic to a particular part or different part of the country with no overlap in their ranges. All 5 species are endangered, some of them quite seriously so. But this one, the Luzon bleeding heart pigeon, is the least endangered of them all. Not surprisingly by its name, the Luzon bleeding heart pigeon is found throughout Luzon and some of its associated islands. Not very often seen, but you can sometimes still see it on Mount Makiling, which is a forested volcano to the south of Manila, and also in the forests in the far north of the country in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Rather unusual looking Coletto is an interesting bird. The only myna that is endemic to the Philippines. It is spread across much of the country and is commonly seen in all sorts of forests, both primary and secondary forests, and also in farmland as well. So it's quite a frequently seen bird, quite close to people. I'm just going to show you a couple of species that are not endemic to the Philippines. They're spread around South and Southeast Asia. This one is the Chinese pond heron, caught here in glorious breeding plumage. It's not something you see all that often, so it is quite nice to see for a change. This one was photographed in Agusan Marsh, which is a vast area of freshwater swamp forest in the far south of the country on the island of Mindanao. So this is a kingfisher species that visitors to the Philippines are most likely to see. It's a very common bird in mangroves and beech forests, and so it's very much a coastal bird. And it was very commonly found in in the trees around beach resorts and also, of course, in neighbouring mangroves. I thought I'd end on something rather cute. It's a fluffy young Philippine scops owl. Now, the Philippine scops owl is quite a common bird spread across much of the country in both primary and secondary rainforest. Uh, this particular individual had fallen out of its nest and then been rescued by a local resident who brought it to the Museum of Natural History at the University of the Philippines in Los Baños. Now, that's a town on the slopes of Mount Makiling, which is a forested volcano near Manila. And she brought it into the office just as I happened to be there talking to the director of the museum. So that enabled me to get a photo of this temporarily captive bird. I am told that the bird was eventually re-released once it had fully fledged. So a good, hopefully, a good ending to this story. So that's the end of this little story. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching and listening. To find out more about my work, feel free to take a tour of my website at nigelhicks.com. To find out about my photography workshops, again, go to the website and find the details there. If you would like to get a hold of a copy of Wild Philippines, then it's available from all good bookshops, both high street and online. And if you would like to find out about a wildlife tour that we're currently planning for the Philippines, then feel free to get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. The contact details are on the screen. Thank you so much for your time today.